Hello friends, this is Growl. In this video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about the City of Threads for Mythic Plus in the War Within. I've been testing all of the dungeons thoroughly on beta, and I wanted to make a quick and easy to understand guide for all of the important mechanics. Remember that this is for Mythic Plus difficulty, so some of the mechanics may be missing if you're running this dungeon on normal or heroic. City of Threads is a straightforward dungeon with no important group composition requirements. The only minor thing is the statues of the queen that you can interact with at the beginning of the dungeon. If you have a priest, rogue, or someone with at least 25 skill in engineering, you can talk to the statue and get a short 30-second buff to your damage, healing, and movement for your group. This can be helpful, but ultimately isn't super important for the success of the run, considering how short the buff is. The beginning of the dungeon can be a bit frustrating with a slew of caster mobs and patrols. Silk binders are caster mobs that continuously cast bolts and roots. These should be interrupted and ideally gathered together so that you can use AoE disruption on them once your team runs out of kicks. Swarm guards patrol the area and frequently cast Ravenous Swarm while in combat. This puts a 5-second damage over time effect on each player that cannot be dispelled. Although this damage isn't lethal, it can quickly lead to deaths when paired with bolts going off from the casters. Go at your own pace in this area, depending on the coordination of your group and how many interrupts you have available. Herald of Ansarek is another lieutenant-style mob that debuffs players with Shadows of Doubt. This deals damage over time to one player and surrounds them in orbs. This debuff can be dispelled, but once dispelled, it shoots out orbs in each direction, stunning and dealing damage to any player they pass through. Although you do want to dispel this debuff, it's a good idea to wait a few seconds to allow the player to position correctly so that nobody else is going to get hit by the orbs. This mob also casts Twist Thoughts, which, if not interrupted, deals damage to a random party member and creates a puddle at their feet that deals increased ticking damage while anyone stands inside. The first boss, Orator Krix'vizk, can be a bit intimidating at first, but once you learn the dance, it actually becomes quite easy. The boss has a very tight circle that you must stand in, and if you leave that circle, you get yoinked in and take extra damage. The boss places the same Shadow of Doubt debuff from earlier on 2 different players at once. One of these players should be dispelled fairly quickly. Just be aware of your ally's position in the circle in order to not get hit. I've seen teams try and maintain a square formation so that dispels can be instant. However, this might be difficult to pull off in random pug groups. After the debuff, the boss casts Indoctrination, which pulses damage to the entire party. Once that cast ends, a pool starts to spawn and grow under the boss, dealing heavy damage to anyone inside. During the damage cast, your party should be stacking on the tank and then moving together in that direction in order to avoid the puddle. If you aren't paying attention, you're very likely to die with the combination of the puddle hitting you and also getting yoinked from the boss as the rest of your team walks away. This cycle repeats over and over until the boss is dead. Continue past the bridge to subdue an easy mini-boss that grants you with a buff, allowing you entry into the city. This part of the dungeon is quite strange. You must uncover 4 eyes of the queen throughout the city. You don't have to fight any of the trash in this area besides the 4 queens. As long as you aren't detected by the guards patrolling around, you can basically just walk freely without aggroing anything. In order to detect which mobs are the queens, you must always follow the path of spirit illusions in the city. You can see where they're facing and follow them. They're almost always going to lead you to the next mini-boss. Generally speaking, there's 1 of these right at the start, and then the other 3 are kind of spread out in different parts of the city. It isn't known yet how these random spawns work. Maybe there might be some sort of pattern or way that you can detect them even faster. Once you uncover the Eye of the Queen, it will become hostile and attack your party, sometimes with even more mobs to help. The main mechanic here to worry about is Void Rush. The mob dashes to multiple players and deals heavy damage, also inflicting a large but short damage over time effect on each person hit. Since you're spending a lot of time running around from spot to spot, you want to just expend all of your damage cooldowns, healing, defensives on these Void Rushes and these mobs, since they can be pretty lethal. This part of the dungeon can be a bit slow and tedious, but things pick up quickly once all 4 of them are defeated. Find your way to Executor Nizral to open the way to the second boss, the Fangs of the Queen. This is a 2-boss council fight that has multiple phases that it cycles through, but in general the mechanics are quite simple. Knife Throw will go out periodically, dealing moderate damage and also applying a short damage over time debuff. Make sure you're healing these up, and if you happen to overlap these with a group damage, use a defensive. NX has a frontal attack, Shade Slash, that also sends a beam out and then copies itself each time it's used and sends the beam out from that location. We found that it wasn't really too difficult to just sort of YOLO this and dodge it, but you may want to be a bit more strategic as a tank for where you're placing these. After a certain amount of time, NX will cast Duskbringer, pulsing light AoE damage to the group. This is dangerous because VX also uses Ice Sickles, a heavy group damage ability, which is a great time to use defensives for both of these. The Icicles leave a 11-second long damage over time on all party members, but this can be dispelled, so it's great to use Dispels, Dwarves, or even something like Mass Dispel from Priests to reduce the damage. In the next phase, VX will cast Rime Dagger on the tank. This creates a blue circle around the tank that must be soaked by your entire party, and it deals moderate group damage. It's a good idea to just preemptively sit around the tank since this mechanic can come out pretty quickly in phase 2. After 2 Rime Daggers come out, there's another Duskbringer, and then the bosses switch back to the first phase. In between each phase, there's sort of a dance line dodge that gives you a little bit of a break in the action and lets some of your cooldowns come up since the damage is so heavy during the phases. Just keep dealing with the mechanics, powering through the group damage, and the Fangs of the Queen will go down. Defeating this boss, as well as the third boss, unlocks a flight point that you can take from the start of the dungeon. We're very far away, so don't run back all the way if you've made it this far. The next area is incredibly mob dense, but most of the mobs here are relatively harmless. Just some basic melee and ranged attacking units with a few casters sprinkled in. On top of the stairs, however, is a giant Crypt Lord, the Royal Venom Shell. This mob has one major mechanic, but it can be quite lethal, Venomous Spray. It puts a long poison on each party member, but is also creating dangerous swirlies on the ground to dodge. It can be very difficult for a healer to keep up with all the dodging, so it's a good spot to use personal defensives, or ideally just poison dispels. In the transformatory, you'll find the last 2 bosses of the dungeon. The hallway is full of eggs that if you run over them, they spawn caster mobs that can be very annoying and don't contribute to the enemy forces of completing the dungeon. For this reason, we preferred not to fight in these hallways and instead to try and pull things into the boss room. You can use this strategy at your own risk. The Unnaturalers are casters that have a long Void Wave cast. If this goes off, it deals group damage and knocks everyone back, so it should be a priority stop, especially in the hallways where you're worried about getting knocked back into the eggs. The Unstable Test Subjects have some group damage and also dodge mechanics, but is a fairly simple mob for how dangerous it looks. Once you clear your way into the third boss room, the Coaglamation is formed. This Void Ooze boss is another fairly simple but fun fight. Orbs fly from the outside of the room inwards toward the boss and must be soaked, or they heal the boss for 5% health per orb. When you soak these orbs as a player, however, they inflict you with Black Blood, a healing absorb that deals damage over time until it's healed off. Generally, you should be soaking as many orbs as possible, and then using a major defensive or self-healing button if your healer starts to fall behind. You don't want to use everything in this phase though, because once the boss reaches 100 energy, it casts Dark Pulse, dealing heavy group damage over 6 seconds. This is a good time to use major healing cooldowns and get stacked for maximum efficiency, since there isn't really much else going on in the fight. After the Dark Pulse, more orbs spawn, and the cycle of the boss repeats again. Once Coaglamation is defeated, you can make your way to the final boss room where you'll meet the 2 mini-bosses. These guys show off the main mechanics of the boss fight. I'll go over them in a second when I talk about the final boss. One thing to know though is fighting these guys together can be really dangerous because you get very scary overlaps. I believe it was intended to only fight one at a time, although they're very close. I wouldn't recommend fighting them together unless you have Bloodlust and an experienced group. Ezo, the Grand Splicer, is another very sequenced boss that has some pretty scary mechanics that get more manageable as you get used to them. Throughout the fight, the boss deals heavy group damage, followed by a major tank buster. Splice is a cast that puts a pretty nasty damage over time effect on your entire party, attempting to soften the group up for the following major group attack. Tremor Slam is the first one. It summons a giant Nerubian that slams the ground, creating a large circle and also dealing a heavy burst of group damage. Umbral Weave also deals heavy group damage, but this mechanic roots players to the ground, and you must destroy the weave on each player to get free. Being free is important because of the orbs that chase you throughout the fight. During each mechanic, Ezo will send the orbs towards players, so be careful and try not to greed casts while breaking the roots or surviving the group damage. After the group damage is over, they will then send all 3 orbs to attack the tank as a major tank buster. The tank must get out of the group and then pop a major defensive in order to survive. This might seem like a lot, but it's the same sequence over and over. Splice, group damage, splice, group damage, and then tank buster. Be sure to actively use and spread out all of your defensive and healing cooldowns, and watch your feet from the orbs. We've found a good strategy is just to stay loosely stacked up for the entire fight so that the healer can get efficient use of AoE heals, and so everyone can AoE down the weaves in order to break out of the roots in time. Once you defeat the boss, the dungeon is over and you can collect your loot. That wraps up my guide to City of Threads in the War Within. If you think there's anything important I missed out, leave it in the comments for others to see. Thanks for watching and happy healing.